Sometimes you just can't do anything other than take action. And somebody will say, well, I live in Vegas and I don't like it, but I don't know where to go. What should I do? And I go, do anything but stay in Vegas. Yeah. And they go, but what if I move to Vancouver and I don't like it? Do you know what you do? You move again. And they're so paralyzed and so concerned about making a mistake that they stay in Vegas. And this idea of, in the absence of clarity, take action. And when you move from Vegas to Vancouver, you go, holy shit, I can't stand Vancouver. Or I realize, actually, I loved Vegas. In other words, nothing other than additional clarity shows up.
Welcome to the Marketing Your Practice podcast, where we guide natural health and wellness experts through the pitfalls of marketing. Each episode, you'll learn simple, effective, easily actionable, and heart-centered marketing strategies. And here's your host, Angus Pyke.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, friends. Welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast. My guest today is Philip McKernan. Now, Philip works with entrepreneurs and business leaders all over the world. And when people are seeking clarity about their future or they want to move through roadblocks, both seen and unseen, they call Philip. Now, as a speaker, he's inspired and challenged the Canadian Olympic team, and he's also worked with the Pentagon as well. And he's now the founder and is spearheading the One Last Talk movement. Philip, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it. Great to be here.
We have a mutual friend in Jennifer Barham who reached out to me and said, you've got to have Philip on the show. I'm sure that you will love his stuff. I had the first bit of your content that I consumed was your interview in London Real, which I set aside 10 minutes to have a quick look. And then an hour and a half later, I finished watching it. And since that moment, then we've been going back and forwards. I want to dive straight in with this. I've got so much I want to speak with you about today, but the concept I want to start with is this. What does it mean to show up unapologetically?
I think the answer that most people expect is to be able to show up and speak your truth and not give a shit what people think. I think the reality is that it's a way of showing up in the world, knowing you care what people think, but despite that, not allowing it to steer you in any particular direction. It's a deep sense of knowing oneself and allowing that person to emerge into the world.
How do we find that person and where does the confidence come through that is the person that is trying to express themselves?
Yeah. Now, again, I'm not trying to be too pedantic and too difficult here, but the word find, if you don't mind me just using that word for a minute, it almost creates the idea or the illusion that we have to go and find it. It's like my dad one day came up to me and said, have you seen my glasses? And they were actually on his head. And this idea of finding, often people think they need to find it behind a bush in Australia, next to some kangaroo or something. It's not. It's basically that person has been there for a very long time. And it's allowing that person, it's an uncovering process rather than a finding. Now, again, we can be talking about exactly the same thing, and I think we are. But yes. I think that energy of finding can be frenetic. It can be this idea that it just doesn't stop. And then for some people, they just go, you know what, I'm just not one of those people. John or Mary or Philip or Henry or whatever, they have found it. I'm just not destined to find it. And then they begin to give up. They begin to give up on the idea of actually finding whatever that is for them. So it's an uncovering, because I think from a very early age, to fit into society, we begin to be somebody else in the small things. And lots of small things compromised over a period of time often means that we actually become somebody we're not in order to fit in with people perhaps that we want or maybe not even want to hang out with. And before you know it, you turn around and you've become somebody else.
I wonder what that concept of kind of uncovering, because when I think about your journey from a child who was perhaps learning disabled right the way through now where you make a living out of communication, I know I've fallen for the concept beforehand that I want my purpose to show up like that. And the day that I find it, uncover it, for it to be 100% clear and no turning back there too. And I was even thinking about it in relation to today, is for me, it's just been a constant evolution that I get greater levels of clarity each and every day. I wonder, is that sometimes how your experience of how that uncovering happens?
Yeah, I actually think it's a great point. I mean, I think that sometimes our insatiable need to know often prevents us from ever actually knowing. And what I mean by that is that sometimes we want a plan and we want a result, and we don't want it tomorrow, we want it yesterday. And I love this balance between this dance between dreaming about the future, reimagining what's possible for our lives, whether it's during a pandemic, before a pandemic, or after a pandemic, but then allowing and letting go. I often say that the most attractive this is probably not the most attractive and inspirational example, but it's a way of describing energetically the right type of person in the right type of mood for the right type of message to emerge. And that is that the sexiest, most attractive person sitting at the bar is not the person sitting there staring at the door, drooling, waiting for the right person, man or woman, to walk into their lives. Nor is the person who has their back to the door with one finger, and the finger I'm talking about, pointing in the direction because of the door, because they're angry, they're sad, they've been let down, and they never want to find love or meaningful relationship again, and they want to be on their own. But the person who's quietly sipping their gin and tonic, who is open to finding love or meaningful relationship or intimacy or whatever, but doesn't need it to define them. And I think that dance is a very delicate dance. It has become increasingly more difficult to encourage people to find that rhythm, because we're in a society that actually, we want to react. And another example I use is Trains, Planes, and Automobiles, the movie that many of us have seen. I often ask people, who are the main actors in that? And they go, John Candy and Steve Martin. And I go, and they go, nobody else. I said, and they go, no, there's nobody else. There's just those two. And I go, well, there's a young Kevin Bacon in the very, very beginnings of that movie. He doesn't even say a word. He's only on the screen for like 8 seconds. And no one even has noticed him, most likely. And we forget that these actors, for example, and you, and when you started out, and we've all started from very, very humble beginnings. And hopefully many of us are still humble. But like, it takes time, and we're not meant to find it straight away. We're meant to continually evolve and for that thing to morph and grow as we do.
Wes, one of the things I was surprised about, and as I continue to read and listen to your content there too, is this paradox. Many people in your field who are coaching headspace stuff are really big all about goals. Set a goal, really clear action path, follow through into that. And yet you've said time and time again that you're against goal setting. Can you tell us a little bit more about why that is? And then how does that fit back into this patience, I think, that you just kind of touched on before, of just living into a future rather than trying to force it?
Yeah, from the very highest level in sport to the very highest level in business and everywhere in between, I have found that goal setting can be very, very effective in terms of achieving things. The challenge is that often we achieve the goals. The analogy, the way I describe it from my personal life, forget about professionally, is I would set goals, and I was pretty good at setting them, and I was really good at achieving them. And I would get to the top of a mountain. I would climb onto the top of that mountain, meaning that mountain was a representation of a business goal or a relationship goal or whatever. And I would stand on that summit, and I don't mean the summit, but I mean a summit. Mm-hmm. And I would look around and I go, Jesus, I thought it would feel better. I thought I'd have a greater sense of achievement or more meaningfulness. And it was empty, or it was shallow. And then I'd do the classic thing where I'd say, oh, I just climbed the wrong mountain, and I'd pick another goal, which represented another achievement in life. And I'd come off that mountain, and sometimes it was 2 or 3 years before I went across the meadows of life and across the valleys and climbed the next mountain. And I often found that sometimes I was creating those goals from a very deep intellectual place of what I thought would make me happy, based on what I knew about myself at the time, and also probably based on what I once, a deep needed, kind of pattern to be accepted and seen in the world by my parents and by my peers. So those things influence a lot of these goals. So having a dream or an aspiration is great, but it's this act of this dance of having something you want, but not being too attached to the outcome, and not needing it to define you, and allowing it to change. Because I think sometimes when we announce something on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, and we announce this big audacious goal or this modest goal, it has become part of who we think we need to be. And I think a lot of us need to reassess, do I want to do this anymore? Is this avenue still a representation of who I am? And sometimes I deal with people in the chiropractic space and the health space. I have a lot of clients in the chiropractic space in particular. And sometimes they run out of steam. They just feel they're starting to question life. And sometimes it's not what they're doing, but sometimes it's the way in which they're doing it. It's not that they're in the wrong area completely. It's just that their energy and their identity has become there's a certain rhythm to it. And they've got out of that rhythm. And the thing is, how often do we sit down and strategize sales, marketing, even review our software and our hardware and our computers and everything else. But how often do we take a step back in our own lives and say, okay, great, I set that goal, but is that me anymore? Is that me? Is that Philip McKernan? Is that the essence of who I am? Or do I need to pivot a little bit? And I just don't think we do that often enough to catch up with where we need to be.
How do you identify, because for me, life is not always smooth. And sometimes I'm trying to get feedback from, is this hurdle in front of me challenging me to be a greater expression, allowing me to serve more people? Or is it just that I just don't give a fuck anymore about it? Like it's not me anymore. How do we identify the difference between those two?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. The thing that I live by is this idea of, in the absence of clarity, take action. Like I honestly say, of all the sayings and all the quotes and all this kind of stuff, and it's the one that has just served me more than anything else. And I'm a master, and you can search the internet and you will never hear me say I'm a master of anything. But on the occasion that I get very, very stuck or very uncertain, which happens because I'm human, despite the fact that whatever people think, sometimes you just can't do anything other than take action. And somebody will say, well, I live in Vegas and I don't like it, but I don't know where to go. What should I do? And I go, do anything but stay in Vegas. Yeah. And they go, but what if I move to Vancouver and I don't like it? Do you know what you do? You move again.
Yes.
And they're so paralyzed and so concerned about making a mistake that they stay in Vegas. And I'm just using Vegas. Don't take it personally if you're from there. Yeah. And this idea of take action, in the absence of clarity, take action. And when you move from Vegas to Vancouver, you go, holy shit, I can't stand Vancouver. Or I realize, actually, I loved Vegas. In other words, nothing other than additional clarity shows up. That's all that happens when you take action. It just may not be the clarity that you want, but it's okay because you can adjust again. The challenge is when we go to make changes in life, we don't just move from Vegas to Vancouver. We buy a house in Vancouver. We lock ourselves in because we need to hold on to something solid because we're afraid of the unknown. And what I'm finding increasingly more and more, this is really aggressive over the last 6 months, is I'm finding that it's not necessarily what we're doing or how we're doing it. It's not even, let's just use this geographic, concept of example. It's not Vegas, nor is it Vancouver. It's somewhere that lies beyond both. It's somewhere that lies beyond both. It's not necessarily where you are or where you're thinking. It's actually beyond both of those. And I see that in the case of impact, identity. I see that in the case of purpose. A lot of us want to write a book, and we think about, we'll write the book that everyone wants or the one that'll sell. Well, what's the book you don't give a shit about whether it'll sell, but the book you want to write, and it sits out here. And then there's one other book that lies beyond that, and that's the book that scares the living shit out of you. And that's the essence of who you are. But the reason we don't write that book or start that business or move to that city or ask that girl or guy out on a date is because there is nothing worse in the world than running the idea that you'll be rejected, pursuing the very thing that you want.
You talk about inside your book, One Last Talk, which I want to get into shortly there too, this concept of our deepest fear is that we won't be loved. And when I read that, it made me feel so sad. Like I kind of got it of all the things of the barriers in between me and where I wanted to move in life. And I had all of these kind of hurdles I thought I got there. And really underneath each one, I just picked it back in all of them there. And there was just this sense that I'm just worried that I won't be loved. So simple. I felt quite vulnerable and raw with it as well. How do you move forwards from that? Where do you go from there? You acknowledge, or for me, like, I don't know how do you push that to the side? Do you move forwards even know that? I don't know where to move forwards from there.
Well, first of all, thank you for sharing. I really appreciate that. How old are you?
45.
Okay, so let's just take I'm 47, so we're very similar in terms of age.
Yeah.
Let's just take somebody who's 45 years old, and whether they get inspired or they read it through the book, or not even not inspired, maybe they just get sad.
Yes.
They read this reality that is very true to them. And they read the fact that actually, in the end of the day, as they look back over their life, many of the things perhaps they've done was a seeking of this sense of love from other people. And let's just say, it's just really simplified in that regard. And they're 45 years old, and they go, good shit, what do I do now? I go, well, maybe you do nothing. It's like somebody coming to me and saying, okay, my wife, Jenny, sent me, do your shit, McKernan, do your magic. And I go, well, what do you mean? Well, my wife thinks I'm an alcoholic, and hey, just will you fix me? And I go, well, do you think you have an issue with drink? And he go, no, not really. No, I could give up any time. No, my friends think I do, but like, honestly, just do your stuff, because honestly, I'm running out of time here. Until the person realizes that they're an alcoholic and have got an issue, nothing is ever going to change, as we both know. So sometimes what we do is we spend a lot of time being busy, because busyness, for many of us, we think is the antidote to uncertainty. And busyness is the very thing that actually keeps us from ever actually connecting emotionally with ourselves. And if we realize something, as, in my personal opinion, as profound as what you just suggested, we spent 45 years living life one way. We realize a set of behaviors or patterns. I think it's really important just to sit and marinate with that for a while, to mourn that, literally, to be sad, and then pick ourselves up and go, now that I know that, what do I want to do differently? What are the parts of my life that I've created that actually align to who I am? And I'm not using the word alignment because many of your viewers or listeners are chiropractors. I use that term, myself all the time. Where in my life am I showing up authentically? What parts of my life really are a reflection of who I am? And just start to tweak and tinker with them.
Yes.
But I think the biggest thing is just to sit in, people are saying a hashtag sit with it is a Philip McKernanism. I'm not sure if it is or not, but I've used it. But it's just sometimes just sit in that shit, because the shit is the very thing we avoid. And yet the shit is the very thing that actually probably can inform us the most. If you think about something I just started to play with recently, if you go into a home in Ireland, particularly, the thing that takes pride of place, apart from family photographs, this is my brother's house, or maybe a map of the world, is the degrees in which the kids have achieved. And I don't mean degrees of achievement. I'm talking about like literally academic degrees. And photographs them up, and I'm looking at them here in their graduation days and everything else. And these are things that, in my personal opinion, really don't define people and really don't have a very big impact in people's lives. But the gifts that we have lie right next to our deepest wounds. Some of the most painful things we've gone through define us more than any educational piece of paper. And yet not one of us that I'm aware of has a photograph of the shittiest day of their life, of the most painful day of their life, next to an academic achievement. I'm not suggesting we print off pictures from days that loved ones have died. But I'm saying, where do we give that a place? Where do we give it oxygen? Where do we give it love? Where do we accept it and bring it into our lives? That despite how painful that thing was, it has deeply defined who I am as a man, or deeply defined who I am as a woman.
Because inside this realization of, at the end of the day, it's all about being loved. There's another statement that you talk about, is that our greatest gift lies right next to our deepest pain. Now, I realized that what drives some of my need to be loved was when my folks separated when I was quite young. And my mum, I went to live with my dad. And my mum, without the emotional skills to be able to cope with what was going on, and I can only think about what it would be like. I've got older children now. But if my 10-year-old boy looked at me and said, Daddy, I want to live with mum now, not you. And if I imagine the pain that would feel for me. And when I said that to my mum, and she looked at me and she said, if you leave now, I never want to see you again. And it was very hard to hear as a 10-year-old boy, to hear that from your mum. And I know she didn't mean it, and we've done lots of work to kind of patch yourself back there. But it's interesting that brings about a wound, and then also a tremendous gift for me now as well, because it is the basis at which I love to serve and care. It's and so in some ways, when I look back on how that created an identity for me, on one hand, I could be miserable about it, and I could tell a horrible story about what happened with my childhood there too. And I know that on the grand scheme of horribleness, it doesn't even rate there too. But it also is, it is the greatest pain has been my greatest gift that's allowed me to move into this ability to serve and care and do all those kind of things there as well. So I'm a little bit kind of torn in terms of where to go with this realization that at the end of the day, it's all about being loved. And where is that, like, so I'm sitting in it, but where is the next step beyond that? Can you move beyond that? Is there a level of self-awareness that we get to the stage that you become immune to that?
When your mother looked at you when you were 10 years old and said, if you move out now, or I never want to see you again. Did you have a logical next step in terms of where this was going to ultimately bring you? So you were going to be sitting at a desk with a microphone impacting people's lives?
Not at that stage. At that stage, yeah.
Exactly. So you're not meant to know right now.
Yes.
That you've got to trust that by this realization for you, this newness thing, this sense of knowing something without knowing what to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
That it's not going to show up for you for another 6 months or another 6 years or another 7 years. It's going to change the way in which you show up on the microphone. Mm. It is going to change the way you show up for your children. It's going to change the way. But here's the thing that people don't realize. There are certain people that will listen to this in the future and they'll go, shit, if my mother said that to me, I wouldn't want to go back and revisit that with her or without her.
Yes.
But here's what you're doing with the greatest respect in the world is you're depriving humanity of the gift on the other side of that, because you cited the reason that I do what I do now is because, not just because of that one incident, but largely because of that, or significantly, or even subtly because of that. In other words, when you start to explore the pain, the gift has no choice but to emerge. So if somebody comes to me and says, Philip, I want to do a coaching call with you because I'm unclear which book to write. I've got 2 books, and I get on a call and I go, great, tell me about it. Well, there's this book called ABC, and there's a huge untapped market here. No one has written a book for this, and I'm telling you, this will be a New York Times bestseller. Between yawning silently and maybe I don't know, picking my nails, I'll then go on and say, well, what's the other book? Well, there's another book that, you know what, honestly, it's a story about my mom and how she dealt with this and everything else. And great. What if you could only write one last book, one book and one book only, and bring it into the world? And it had to impact somebody, one person in the world. What would that book be about? Well, it would be about swimming. Why? Because I watched my grandfather die in front of me in the ocean. I'm making an extreme example. I said, that's the book I want to know about. And that's the book that humanity needs to know about. Because that's the book that deep down, most artists that we've heard of, even the greatest artists we've heard, I believe, have died with, in many cases, with their greatest work still inside of them. And one of the greatest tragedies, I believe, is walking around a mountain, walking down a road, walking through a village, walking into a bar and meeting the person that you could have been. And that sounds kind of corny and cliche and fun and inspirational or just annoying to a lot of people. But at the end of the day, so many of us are just afraid to write and speak into the world the very thing that is the essence of who we are.
It's let's talk about this concept, this movement going forwards. That is the One Last Talk that has now evolved into a book, which I want to encourage all of our readers to get a hold of. I'll have some links in the show notes too. Can you share a little bit of the evolution of this movement, how it began and the kind of impact that it's having on people around the globe?
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's more important than me. It's something that I don't feel I have a choice around, if that makes any sense. And I say that in hopefully you understand what I mean by that. But I became quite disencouraged when I travel around the world speaking, and I speak way less now. And I would go to events, and there's these weird dynamics of these, not all live events, but many live events, where there is the guru on stage and there is the submissive audience who are sitting there listening. And then there's this other dynamic that you don't actually get to meet the speakers necessarily, or really get to live with them. And many of the speakers that I would meet would be one person on stage, and they step off stage and become somebody else, which is fine if that's what they want to do, but just let the audience know that that's the other side of the coin, in my personal opinion. And this dynamic where the audience are meant to, take notes and listen or judge or whatever, and that the person on the stage is the all-seeing eye. So I wanted to kind of reverse that, and I wanted to create an environment where the people in the audience are the ones that are sharing the wisdom. And I wanted to create an environment where we could prove to the people in the audience that they do have immense wisdom. That, yes, look to other people for inspiration, but don't define your lives by them. And the other thing I realized as well is that there is not a place for us to necessarily talk about our wounds in a slightly more public environment. So I created this idea called the Real Summit. And the idea was I would pick, 8 everyday individuals that haven't achieved maybe billions of dollars in turnover or won a gold at the Olympics or whatever, but they've done their own magnificent things. And with the greatest respect in the world, the one thing I'd just love to go back, because, you were open with it, is that, when that comment from your mother at 10, you said, in the greater scheme of things, it's, it's not that tragic or whatever. Well, with the greatest respect in the world, to me, it's probably for a 10-year-old the most tragic thing you could actually possibly have gone through. And when I ask somebody to do a one last talk, they often go, geez, not me, but my friend Jen, oh my God, does she have a story? Oh God, you've got to get her story, Philip. It's incredible. Yeah. But I don't have anything, Philip. I mean, I wasn't abused when I was a kid. I didn't do this. I didn't watch somebody die. I didn't whatever. And every single person has a magnificent, painful, beautiful story. And I used to think that my story didn't matter because I didn't think it was significant enough. And I had no right to position it next to somebody who had something that in societal terms is more dramatic. And you watch these men and women get on stage and share the thing that they'd never wanted to share. And it's about them, but it's for humanity. And I'll just share one quick example. The very first lady I asked, her name is Bev. Her story's in the book. And I asked Bev, would she do a talk? And she said, oh my God, Philip, me speaking? I've never talked to anybody in my life. I'm not a speaker. And eventually she agreed to do it. And she's decided that she would speak about the Aboriginal community, or in Canadian terms, it was considered the First Nations. And she would speak about them. And I looked at her, I said, are you a First Nations? And she said, no. I said, well, what's your background with them? Well, not really, but I just think it's really important. I said, it is really important. I'm not trying to diminish the importance of it, but it has to be a part of you. So in the midst of this Real Summit, I said, Bev, think about it as if this was your one last talk. And she just goes, whoa. And then somebody else went, oh my God, wow. And then suddenly I went to GoDaddy, and there at the ripe old price of $8.99 was one last talk, and I bought onelasttalk.com. When Bev got up and shared her story, she talked about the day she found her son after committing suicide. And to this day, I have never been more inspired, moved, and sad all at the same time. Because she didn't finish her talk by going, now you should do this and you should do that. There's none of that. You're not allowed to do that.
Yes.
You have to share a part of your personal story. You're not allowed to talk about Donald Trump, global warming, pandemic, any of that stuff. And at the end of it, she said, if I could turn back the clock, here's what I would have done differently. I would have told him I loved him more. I would have put my goddamn phone away. I would have focused less on money. And I would have given less of a shit about the grades that he was getting. Is there any better parenting advice on earth than those 4? Yes, there's other things. So it's not telling us, it's showing us, and then we can glean from that. And that was the beginning of One Last Talk, and that has been its evolution. It's now One Last Letter is the thing we ask people to do. One Last Startup is something we're playing with. Like if you were to create one business and one business only, would you build that widget or would you create something else? What's the idea in your back pocket? That's the thing that fascinates me. So that's One Last Talk in a nutshell. And and we're very privileged to, be a small part of that.
It is a beautiful framework, and there are some rules that go along with it too, which, no PowerPoint, no fancy music, no my 3 steps to living a happier life, all those kind of things there too, which as you started to lay down those rules, it made it more and more difficult for me to put together my one last talk, but therefore it made it a lot more meaningful as well. There is some interesting in the book as well. You go through a series of steps leading up to, of which I've been doing with my family and around the dinner table. We've, gone through our 5 favorite days, and, we sat down and talked through those too. I'm building up towards, because you also write down the 5 worst days that you've had as well. And I'm nervous to have that conversation with the family, but I think we will find a spot over the dinner table that might be powerful for all 5 of us to actually share that, for all 4 of us to share those as well. So there are so many beautiful stories inside of this as well. I'm so moved with all of this, Philip, in terms of knowing sort of where to move to as well. If people want to, the One Last Talk is a movement that's happening all over the globe. These kind of talks are set up, or how would somebody kind of participate in one?
So what we encourage people to do is we believe everyone should write their one last talk.
Yeah.
Whether they give it to an audience or not, it's not the point. We believe for the one last talk to have any type of potency and power, it needs to be delivered to one other individual on earth.
Yes.
And it's like a one last letter. So if you did nothing else after this, and you felt that one last talk was too big a jump, you're not a speaker, you don't know how to write talks or whatever, don't worry about it. Just write a one last letter, and the one last letter, pick one person that you want to write a one last letter to, write it as if no one's ever going to read it. That's the point. If I ask you to write it and then read it out on this podcast, you'd probably write it in a way that would make you look good. So I believe in my core that in the end of the day, all of us want to make an impact. The challenge is we want to look good doing it.
Yes.
And that is about this theme, back to this unapologetic theme, is that the greatest impact we make often doesn't necessarily always set ourselves up society to look the best at the time. They could be the snotty, messy tears rather than the controlled performance tears. But at the end of the day, that's the shit that makes the biggest impact, like real impact. And I would encourage people at the very least to consider sitting down and writing a one last letter, even to themselves, but also to somebody else. And if you choose to give it to them, great. But it is, I'm not suggesting there's no other amazing modalities in the therapeutic world, and different modalities, but it's one of the most effective ways to begin to understand who you are to your very, very core, and to begin to accept those parts of us that a lot of us have tried to excommunicate outside of us. I mean, a lot of us want to find something inside of us and get rid of it. My job is to help them dissolve some of it, so basically it loosens its grip, so it's not gripping you as much. But then can we live with the balance? So when the thing I didn't tell you about Bev, and Bev is this little lady. I mean, and I say little, she's one of the smallest women I've ever seen. She's tiny. She's so small, but my God, she must have a heart of a rhinoceros. Mm. And the thing that no one knows about is like, well, why would you get her up there and ask her to speak about the day she found her son died? Like, what would the purpose of that be? What possibly could help her or humanity in that? Well, number one is it gives us perspective when we lose perspective when it comes to bringing up our own kids. When we get busy building the real estate portfolio, or get busy building this or this legacy, or what we think our kids want, it's a gentle reminder, or maybe a not so gentle reminder, of what's really important. But the other thing that Bev had is another son. And that boy lost his brother and his mother. When his brother committed suicide, he lost his brother and his mother. When Bev did her one last talk, it was the first time on earth she let go and started to accept it as part of who she was, because up to that point, she had blamed herself. She then gave her one last talk and realized the impact it was giving to other people. I've never been at an event where an audience member leaves their chair, walks onto a stage, and holds somebody else. That's what happens. This woman walked up and held Bev, held her. Mm. She wasn't trying to get accolades or trying to be seen where a lot of people at events. She just wanted to hold Bev. And what Bev walked, when she walked off the stage, within the first hour when we connected, she says, I had no idea my talk mattered, that this story mattered to anybody. And people were crying. And I went to the audience and I said, what are you going to do as a result of this talk? Not what do you feel and what are you going to do? One guy says, I'm going to take my daughter on a date night. The other guy says, I'm going to turn off my phone. This girl says, I'm going to do this. So Bev now realizes that her greatest pain, her greatest shame, her greatest guilt that she wanted to bury, which was killing her, by the way, is the very thing that was going to set her free.
Yeah. I remember Bev's story so clearly. There's a number in there that is so incredibly moving. I wish I could remember the name of the gentleman who told the story about him murdering somebody. And the visceral response that I had, the stories up until then, and I got this and I watched, because you talk about later on in the book, I watched my emotion towards him and my judgment, which is what you mentioned in the book there too, immediately, like, all right, let's kind of see where we get to in this situation here too. So I wonder with it there too, because even the story that you've talked about, Bev, and some of the stories I've related to, there really are profound stories there too. And inside my head too was, well, I don't, and I know you touched on this beforehand, but I would imagine that many of our listeners were like, I don't have that.
Yeah. And by the way, I think we made a huge mistake in the book because, and I take full responsibility, even though I was advised to put certain stories in, I take full responsibility for this. I think we made a big mistake because we put in the book, let's just say there's 5 stories. We put in 5 societally sensational stories, if that makes, kind of dramatic stories in one way, shape, or form.
They are very.
And I think what we've done is, imagine a chiropractor, a health professional, they've got a retail store and they've got 5 photographs on their front window of 5 athletes that they've worked with, adjusted, given advice to, helped with their blood work, etc., over a 5-year period, each of them wearing gold medals. And they're ripped and they've got big muscles and everything else. And I'm Joe Soap and I'm walking down the road and I'm about to knock on the door and walk in and go, screw this. I'm going to go to somebody else because I feel completely intimidated by this.
Yes.
And I think that's part of our own immaturity and our own kind of almost trying too hard. And even my bio that you read, with the greatest respect in the world, is the one that's on our website. It just doesn't land with me anymore. And I think the mistake we made, which amongst many, is that those stories are not invitational. They don't draw people. They're amazing stories. I do believe that, but they're not indicative of an average, I hate that word average, but an everyday individual walking the streets who hasn't committed murder, who hasn't stood on the edge of a building, wanted to take their own life, and hasn't found their own son having committed suicide. And therefore we've almost created this unreachable idea that actually, therefore my talk doesn't matter. And that's the last thing on earth we wanted to do.
Yeah.
But thanks for bringing that up, because I believe that was a fundamental mistake and something that we've identified. And now all the events, in fact, one of the things we're proud of is the fact that 80-90% of the people we asked to speak on stage have never actually spoken before.
Yeah.
Because they're the people who have the most extraordinary stories. So please, listeners, don't, and it's not even about selling books. This is about the idea of going through one last talk. Don't assume that it's not for you, because I think it's for everybody.
Yeah. And I think too, for the audience that are listening here as well, inside the book are so many little, I was tempted, because you challenged inside there that, listen, don't just read this book and say you're going to do these things afterwards. Well, no, look, I'm going to, in the book I've got here, I've got the letter that I've written, the 5 favorite days, my 5 worst days. It made the book so much more impactful. And that in itself helped me get over this idea that I need to have had some kind of cathartic experience in the past or something horrific, because they don't match up to some of these stories inside of there as well. So, Philip, I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge and thank you for staying true to yourself as things have unwound, for identifying this one last talk, for continuing to evolve as a human being. I get to ride on the coattail of just the wisdom that comes from your mouth as well. So thank you so much for all that you continue to do there as well. Any last thoughts that you'd like to leave our audience with?
I think I think actually I'll just build on what you just said, and while I greatly appreciate what you said, one of the most difficult things for me has been to continue to do what I do and to continue to show up and to continue to hopefully evolve, but not allow this work to define and to try to take too much ownership of it. And that has been probably one of the most important things for me, is realizing that, and there are days where my ego is on steroids and my ego wants all of it. Come on, give it to me, give it to me. I'm the guy, I'm the founder, I'm this, I'm this. And what I'm realizing more and more is that the day I realized and really start to live into this idea that actually my work is not about me, that I am just here to create a conversation, to challenge people, whatever it happens to be. If more of us could realize that in this world, is that we get caught up in this I thing. We're looking at an opportunity very recently, and our slogan, if you like, is "Be brave, you matter." And I was getting very fearful, like, can I afford this? And is this going to be right for me? And oh my God, is this the right move for my family and everything else? And my 11-year-old looks at me and says, "Dad, be brave. This matters." And I looked at my wife and I said, if we pursue this, if we go forward this, will this help people heal? If we make this decision? And she said yes. And suddenly all the fear that I was feeling about this very significant opportunity just dissipated, just disappeared from my body, because it wasn't about me anymore. And I think that it's not about just being selfish, but I think inadvertently a lot of us forget that we end up becoming consumed about what's in it for us. And I think when it comes to your one last talk, when it comes to your practice, when it comes to visualizing what's possible for you and the impact you can make in this world, if you stop making it about you, which is a very simple, it sounds simple, but it gets in on you, it gets into your skin. And you say, how can I show up for others? I think that's when some of our greatest work, our greatest writings, our greatest impact and our greatest expression shows up. And I think that's when we become the most unapologetic versions of who we are.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Philip, thank you so much. I look forward to the day that hopefully I get to meet you in person. Thanks for all that you do and continue to do. And thanks for being a part of the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out the Community Influencer Program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work one-on-one with you to apply, implement, systematize, and help guide you and your practice to the next level. Now you can join me over at adiomedia.com/join. That's adiomedia.com/join. I'd love to see you in there.